Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome. I'm Andy Rich. I'm the Dean of the Colin Powell School, and I want to welcome you to what is our second Rick and Susan Goings Conversation in Leadership. This is a new series for us, and we're thrilled to have former Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice with us this afternoon. So, the Colin Powell School is the School of Social Sciences at City College. We're the home of leadership development and public service programs. We are home to 4,000 students out of the 15,000 here at City College, and we view our mission fundamentally as trying to transform the most diverse population of students in the nation into tomorrow's global leaders. And it's an amazing mission, an exciting mission, and it's a mission that comes to us directly from our founder and our namesake, General Colin Powell. General Powell went to City College, graduated in 1958, was born here in Harlem, grew up in the South Bronx, and when it came to college, it was City College or nowhere. And he came here and he found his purpose, he found his passion, and most importantly, he found ROTC. And he went on to become the first Black American to become chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the highest military command in the country, and U.S. Secretary of State. And when he finished his service to the country, he came back to City College and he looked for ways that he could be involved. We put him in a room with a group of our students, and he went around and asked them to introduce themselves, and he instantly said, "My God, they're just like I was 50 years ago." And from that minute on, he recommitted himself to this school, and he served as our leader, involved with us every day, really, until his passing last year. One of the things he did as our leader was introduce us to his friends and introduce his friends to us. And one of those friends is Rick Goings. Rick Goings served with General Powell on the board of Boys and Girls Club of America. Rick Goings was the chairman and CEO of the Tupperware Company for many years, and he recruited General Powell to the board of Boys and Girls Club of America when he was chairman of that board, and said to Rick, I think a number of times, "Come see my school." And when Rick got to know us, we started a conversation about how we could elevate the important work we're doing here with broader audiences. And when General Powell passed away last year, we accelerated that conversation and came up with the idea of this series, the Rick and Susan Goings Conversations in Leadership, to have conversations with some of the most interesting folks who are at the very top of their professions and talk with them about not what they did at the tops of those professions, but rather how they got there and where they started and what are the elements of leadership that they learned along the way. And so, Rick, I want to acknowledge you and thank you very much for your support of this program. And you're going to meet Susan Goings, who's his partner in all of this, in just a minute. Thank you for being here today, and it's my privilege and pleasure now to introduce you to the president of City College, Vince Boudreau.
Thank you, Andy. I want to first of all start by adding my thanks to Rick and to Susan for this. It is deeply important. General Powell, he wanted these conversations in leadership from the very moment he got engaged with the campus. He was provoking these conversations, not just by introducing us to his friends, but insisting to me and to Andy that this is a central, important part of what he wanted to happen at the college. And I want to talk to the students right now specifically, because there's a reason why he thought so strongly about this. And you know, he helped us bring incredibly accomplished people, former Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice among them, to the campus to talk to you. But he also knew, because he went that same path himself, that you may believe, sitting here in this audience, that despite what General Powell said about, growing up in the Bronx and City College or nothing, you probably believe that on the day he was born, or when he was studying, or when he was at City College, that somewhere, if you looked hard enough, there was a light that you could see that say, oh yeah, this is the guy that's going to be Secretary of State. And he was insistent that that wasn't true. He was insistent that when he looked out at our student population, he didn't just see himself in you nostalgically or metaphorically or rhetorically. He wanted you to understand that there was nothing besides a City College education and graduation day that separates you today from what he was like when he graduated. And that puts you on a path when you see these leaders to follow them, to aspire to what they have done. And it was really, really important to him to understand that every way you could think about the difference between you and him, these conversations were supposed to chip away at, were supposed to erode. Right? This institution for 175 years has taken students just like you and put them on a path to becoming people like General Powell, right? Like Rick Goings, like Condoleezza Rice, and like 1,000 other kinds of successful people in the world. So if you are in the audience right now thinking he's talking about everybody else but me, you're wrong. I see you. You're out there. That's what this institution does, and that's what these conversations are supposed to provoke. So I'm thrilled to be here for the next step in the realization of General Powell's vision for his ongoing conversation with the leaders of the future at the City College of New York. So thank you. Do I give this to?
So it is my privilege now to introduce our speakers. Condoleezza Rice, in many respects, needs no introduction. She was the 66th U.S. Secretary of State and the first Black woman to hold that post. When we started conceiving of this series, she was one of the first names that came to our minds. She, in some ways, made it easier for us because she wrote an op-ed, or she wrote a kind of tribute to General Powell that appeared in the Washington Post right after he passed. And she ended it by saying that the thing he most enjoyed talking to her about later in life was the Colin Powell School. And he asked her time and again to come visit his school. And she didn't get to do it before he left us, but she promised to come now, and here she is. So we're grateful to have her and really feel fortunate that she's made time for this in a busy, busy schedule in New York. I want to turn it over to Susan Goings. So Susan Goings, in addition to helping with Rick to sponsor this series, when I got to know her first, it was when Rick shared with me an interview that she had done with General Powell from some years back, and it was incredibly compelling. It was one of the best interviews I'd ever seen with General Powell that really got him to open up. And when he passed away, it was in fact the video, it was the recording that we shared with the entire Colin Powell School community. And so when we conceived of this series, I asked Susan, would she even consider being the moderator, and she has kindly agreed to do it. And so, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Susan Goings and former Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice.
Thank you, Andy, very much. And Vince, really appreciate it. And thank you, everybody who's joining us today as we chat with Condoleezza Rice. I've interviewed a lot of politicians, a lot of celebrities, but I have to say, she by far is the most accomplished of all of them, without a doubt. And I look forward to her sharing her story of growing up in Birmingham, Alabama during a time, a racially charged time with segregation, and how she overcame all of that to become one of our greatest world leaders. So please welcome Dr. Condoleezza Rice. Thank you. I'm so glad you're here with us.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. Well, finally. Looking forward to it, yes.
So as Andy mentioned, the article you wrote in the Wall Street Journal right after Colin died, it was really beautiful, very poignant. And at the end, you mentioned that your last conversation, or one of the last conversations, was about the school. Can you share that conversation with us?
Absolutely. Well, almost every conversation that I had with Colin was about this school. He knew that I had spent my life in the academy, and he knew how much I loved teaching. And he was so proud of the fact that the school carried his name. As I think was just said, he believed and saw in each student himself, meaning the chance to find what you're passionate about, to find what you're good at doing, to marry them together into a life of public service. And he just loved this place, but not the place, not the school, not the administration, the students. He talked glowingly about some of his encounters with the students, and kept telling me, you have to come, you have to come.
How would you describe Colin as a leader, since we're here talking about leadership?
Well, Colin was inspiring and actually a little intimidating sometimes.
Even to you?
As a leader. Oh, yes. Well, I have to tell you, I first met Colin Powell when he was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and I had a one-year fellowship working for, he was National Security Advisor at the time, and I had a one-year fellowship working in the Pentagon, and I got this call saying that General Powell would like to invite me to lunch.
Wow.
And I said, you mean General Colin Powell wants to invite me to lunch? And I think I was 29 or 30 years old. And within a few minutes, I realized that even though I was a little intimidated by meeting Colin Powell, he put me right to ease. And I think one of the symbols, or one of the characteristics of great leaders, is that they're able to deal with people in their station in life, meet them where they are, not be here and expect everybody to come up to them. And I watched Colin with other people in the administration. I watched him with the sergeant major that we would see when we were out on a base someplace. I watched him with young students when he came to, I was also very involved, like Rick, with the Boys and Girls Clubs. And he came and visited one of our Boys and Girls Club sites that I had started a program at in a place called East Palo Alto on the other side of the tracks, literally from Stanford. And I watched him meet those kids exactly where they were. And so I think Colin just had that capacity to inspire people wherever they were.
So it sounds like he was also a mentor.
He was a mentor, and he could be a demanding mentor. You know, I think one of the things about mentorship is that it has to be earned. I don't like it when people say, will you be my mentor? And I think, well, I don't know if I'll be your mentor. I don't know anything about you. And let's get to know each other first. And let's figure out how I can help you, but also how you can help yourself. Because a mentor can't substitute for your hard work and for your desire and commitment. And so I think Colin also was someone who believed that mentorship was a two-way street. He had to be a good mentor, but the mentee had to be all in.
So how was he demanding with you?
He was, well, I'll tell you a very funny story. So I said that he came out to visit me in California. And I actually I had not driven into the area because it was a new Boys and Girls Club. And so we got in the car from Stanford and we're driving along and I kept missing the exit. And finally, Colin says to me, don't you know where you're going? Didn't you advance this? I said, in case you don't notice, I don't actually work for you anymore, so, you know. But that's the way he was. How could you not advance this? So he could be demanding.
I saw that side in him also.
Yes.
Yeah, but a really fun dinner partner.
A very fun dinner partner. And funny.
Yeah.
You remembered, you know, the great sense of humor. But I also told him once, I said, you know, you have this characteristic that you can read the phone book and sound like you're reading the Declaration of Independence.
Yeah.
I mean, he just was also one of the really compelling communicators.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
He told a funny story one time about you guys at Buckingham Palace.
Oh, yes. So just imagine, we went on a state visit to for the Queen of England, Queen Elizabeth, the late Queen Elizabeth, at Buckingham Palace. And so we stayed overnight at Buckingham Palace.
You slept?
We slept in Buckingham Palace.
Wow.
So there was one bedroom, which was mine, and then there was a sitting room in between, and there was another bedroom where Colin and Alma were staying. And we actually had a maid who came and asked if she could unpack me. So I'm in there trying to help her unpack, and Colin came in. He said, you know, they've been doing this for like 300 years. I think you're in her way. Why don't you just let her do this? But then we sat in our little anteroom between us. And people may not fully know Alma's story. So Alma Powell, Alma Johnson Powell, was from Birmingham. I knew her family in Birmingham.
I didn't know that.
Oh, yes. Her father was the principal of the largest black high school in Birmingham, Parker High School, because the schools were segregated in those days. And he was a huge figure in Birmingham because these school principals were huge figures. And so Alma and Colin and I were sitting in that little room, and we had a glass of champagne, and we said, what would our fathers and mothers think of this? These two little girls from Birmingham, Alabama, and a son of West Indian immigrants sitting here, all dressed up, white tie, ready to go to this dinner with the Queen of England, what would they have thought of that? And so we had a moment to thank our parents.
I will say Alma and you, both raised in the South in Birmingham,
Yes.
two of the most gracious people and just dignified and lovely. Lovely,
you.
both of you.
Thank
Both
you.
of you. I mentioned during my intro that your list of accomplishments. So I might embarrass you right now, or I might, but it's going to take a few minutes. But I want you all to know everything that she has accomplished, because this school is all about training global leaders who are diverse. And this is the perfect example of what we should all aspire to be, but especially you guys who are students here at the Colin Powell School. So she graduated from high school at 16, college at 19. Correct me if any of this is wrong.
That's right.
Then she got her master's and then earned her doctorate. And by the way, only 2% of the world's population actually have a doctorate. And sadly, in the United States, it's only 1.2%. So that's quite a feat. And then you have more than a dozen honorary degrees. 4 times she's been on Time Magazine's 100 Most Influential People list. You're a concert pianist who at 15 performed with the Denver Symphony. You also played with the great cellist Yo-Yo Ma. You speak multiple languages, including French and Russian. You were the advisor to President H.W. Bush, the first Bush president, during the dissolution of the Soviet Union, so I imagine your Russian came in handy at that time. She's the youngest provost ever at Stanford University and the first woman. The first female national security advisor, which was in 2001. And I know that there were, there wasn't actually a national security advisor until 1953 in the Eisenhower administration. But every president before that had somebody in that position. They just didn't have that title. So you were the first woman in 225 years. The first black female Secretary of State, inaugural member of the College Football Playoffs Selection Committee, which my friend Chuck, who's here in the audience, tells me is the most impressive thing on the list. The first female member at Augusta National Golf Course. One of the owners of the Denver Broncos football team. Who knew that? And I hear you're such a great ice skater that you could probably have been a professional.
Okay, so so now let me give my rendering of this, all right? So young 3-year-old Condoleezza is staying with her grandmother while her parents teach school. And her grandmother teaches piano lessons at 25 cents a lesson. And young Condoleezza decides she wants to learn to play the piano. So I started playing piano when I was 3. And by the time that I went to college, I was destined to be a great concert pianist. So the first part of the story is that I went to college, majored in piano performance, and decided I was good but not great, and I was going to end up teaching 13-year-olds to murder Beethoven, and I'd better find something else to do. So the first story is actually one of the failure of the first passion.
Okay.
And that's an important story for everybody to understand. I wanted desperately to be a concert pianist. And I was good, but I was not going to play Carnegie Hall. And I wasn't as talented as all those 12-year-olds who I met in music school who could already play from sight everything it had taken me all year to learn. And I thought, okay, I need a plan B. And fortunately for me, I wandered into a class in international politics in my junior year in college. Now, I dumped my piano major, so when my students asked me, how do I get to do what you do? I said, you start as a failed piano major, all right? So I was a failed piano major. I wandered into a class in international politics taught by a man named Joseph Corbell. He was Madeleine Albright's father.
Wow.
And Joseph Corbell was the one who introduced me to things international, things Russian. He introduced me to the Soviet Union, to diplomacy.
Did you speak Russian at that time?
I did not at that time. And that's when I realized, well, I want to do something in that area. So I would say to the students, if you haven't quite figured out what it is that you're passionate about, keep looking. And if you're not careful, it might find you. And the other part of that is that there was no earthly reason that a black girl from Birmingham, Alabama ought to want to be a Soviet specialist. And fortunately, nobody said to me, well, that's kind of weird. Why would you do that? Your passion is your passion. And don't let anybody look at you and how you look or where you come from and tell you you can't be passionate about something. So that's my re-rendering of the story. And it is true that I got to play with Yo-Yo Ma, the great cellist. I was National Security Advisor, and he asked me to play with him for his National Medal of the Arts ceremony. But let's be very clear, I was not playing with Yo-Yo Ma because I was the world's greatest pianist. Right? I was playing with Yo-Yo Ma because I was the National Security Advisor who could play the piano. So let's keep that in perspective, Susan.
But it's a great gift to be able to realize and be honest with yourself about what you're good at and what you're not good at.
It is, and it's also sometimes to have people who push you. So when I was 10 years old, I announced to my mother, grandmother, and great-grandmother were all musicians. And I announced to my mother that I was tired of piano and I was quitting. And she said, "You're not old enough or good enough to make that decision." And I kept playing. And so when I was about to play with Yo-Yo Ma, I looked toward the heavens and thanked my mother for making me continue to play. So sometimes somebody has to intervene a little bit to keep you on track.
As I read all those accolades and things that you've accomplished, I'm reminded, I don't even know, maybe 10 years ago, you and Rick and I are at the Atlanta headquarters of the Boys and Girls Clubs of America, waiting to go into a meeting with a group of people. Roxanne Spillett was holding the meeting.
Yes.
And you and Rick, for some reason, are talking about your college experience and your SAT scores. And neither one of you had done very well on your SATs. Right. I remember saying that you weren't good at standardized tests.
Right.
And I'm sitting there thinking, wow, I did so much better than the two of them. And look how successful they are. And so how do you go on and accomplish all this? It's just amazing.
Well, in my case, I was very fortunate and this is going to sound a bit paradoxical, I'm glad I grew up in segregated Birmingham.
Really?
I am.
Why?
I grew up in a little neighborhood. I think everybody taught school in my neighborhood. My parents were teachers. And so they could have had limited horizons for what was possible for us. You couldn't go to a movie theater. You couldn't go to a restaurant. I didn't have a white classmate till we moved to Denver. But they had high expectations for us. And they never let us make excuses for our circumstances. And so they would always say, you have to be twice as good. Now, they didn't say, it's really sad that you have to be twice as good, or it's really unfair that you have to be twice as good. They said, you have to be twice as good. So we went around trying to be twice as good. Now you work twice as hard. Now you're twice as confident. And so when you walk into a room and somebody looks at you because you look different, and you can kind of feel that sense that maybe they're discounting you a little bit because you look different. You know deep down inside that you may look different, but you're really every bit as good at what you're about to do as they are. And so you don't have that moment of self-doubt. And so I'm very glad that my parents and their friends, it was a little community that I grew up in. My dad was, by the way, a Presbyterian minister as well. He was a high school guidance counselor during the week and a Presbyterian minister on the weekend. And so, you know, faith, family, and education. But education was really the key. If you could be educated, you could do just about anything.
And education is the key.
Education is the key.
It still is the key.
It's still the key.
For everybody.
That's right.
You wrote a book about your mom and dad, and you called them Extraordinary Ordinary?
Extraordinary Ordinary People.
Why?
In many ways, they were ordinary people. My mom was a school teacher. My dad was a high school guidance counselor, Presbyterian minister, and later on a university administrator. I would doubt they ever made between them in working as hard as they did, $75,000, $80,000 a year, between them. Both working full-time jobs, and my father working 2 or 3 jobs. But there was nothing that they believed I couldn't do, and nothing that they didn't want to give me the opportunity to do. And sometimes they gave me the opportunity to do things that I was good at, like music, and sometimes they encouraged me to do things that I wasn't good at, like tap dancing and things like that. But yeah, it really is a true story. So when I was 7 years old, 2nd grade, and we had a talent show. And my dad was a minister, and the little girls were supposed to, I was going to be one of the Supremes in the talent show. And so we were, stop in the name of love. And my father decided this was undignified for the daughter of a minister, and that I couldn't play Diana Ross. So he decided instead that I would learn to tap dance, and I had a little tap dancing routine to Sweet Sue. Now, not to find a point at it, I was terrible. I mean, really awful.
So we found one thing that you're not
No,
good
but
at.
my dad stood in the corner. My dad was 6'3", played football. My dad stood in the corner like this so that the audience could see him, so that nobody laughed. And once I finished, everybody applauded. Yeah, but I never tried tap dancing again.
When I read that book, and I'm also born the same year you are, I grew up in the South.
You mean you were born in 1980 as well?
Yes, I was.
Oh, okay, yeah.
But I'm a little bit older. I was born in March.
Oh, okay,
Yeah.
all right, yeah.
And I read that and I thought, okay, I don't think they were so ordinary, because your parents were college educated. Mine were not.
Yes.
And my parents never said to me, well, they never taught me to read. I taught myself. Did you finish your homework, or where are you going to go to college? And so I think your parents were absolutely extraordinary people.
Yes.
I mean, you were so blessed, and that's not something that necessarily everybody has, statistically.
No, I thank the Lord every night for the parents that I had. And I was really tremendously benefited by their education. My grandfather went to college, as a matter of fact. And his is a great story, because talk about toughness and desire. So he was a sharecropper's son in Utah, Alabama. And the way you spell that, by the way, is E-U-T-A-W. I'm not kidding, Alabama. And he decided he wanted to get book learning in a college. And so he asked how a colored man could go to college. They told him about Little Stillman College, a Presbyterian school about 30 miles from where he lived. So he saved up his cotton. He went off to Stillman College, finished his first year. They said, so how are you going to pay for your second year? He said, well, I'm out of cotton. And they said, well, you're out of luck. But then he said, so how are those boys going to college? They said, well, you see, they have what's called a scholarship. And if you wanted to be a Presbyterian minister, you could have a scholarship too. My grandfather said, that's exactly what I had in mind. And my family has been Presbyterian and college educated ever since. So it was really my grandfather
Who started
started the college education. But at some point, each and every one of us gets somebody who says, all right, you can do this. I mean, Colin has done this for this school. You can do this. The education is there for you. And all that I would say to any of us who are fortunate enough to be educated is pay it back. That's why I love the Boys and Girls Clubs. Find somebody who you can take and say, all right, education is yours too. It doesn't just belong to those whose parents went to college or whose grandparents went to college. It should belong to all of us.
But it is a blessing. I mean, my parents were very loving and great providers. But just not college educated like yours. And so now with the next generation, that's been changed.
Yes.
And it is education.
It is education.
All keeps coming back to that.
That's right.
And when I read that book, I was really sorry that both your parents passed before your greatest successes.
Well, my mother died young. She was 61, breast cancer. But even that, you can find silver linings, because she first had breast cancer when I was 15. And she lived another 15 years. And you have to ask yourself, the difference between being 15 when you lose your mother or 30 when you lose your mother is huge. And so I've always been grateful to God for those years. And then my dad knew that I'd become National Security Advisor. He died shortly before I left for Washington.
The example you just gave, I see that throughout your life, your positivity, and how you look for the upside in just about everything. Has that served you well and helped you along your path?
Yes, I guess I don't see any point in being pessimistic. I mean, getting up every morning feeling bad about things or being pessimistic. And I've also, you asked about leadership, nobody wants to follow a sourpuss, right? Nobody wants to follow somebody whom things are always bad, things are always so tough. And I try to keep perspective. Whenever we were going through some difficult times, and after 9/11 and the like, You know, that summer I was reading some of the biographies of the American founding fathers, you know, and thinking, yeah, you're fighting a war against the greatest military power of the time. A third of George Washington's troops are down to smallpox on any given day. There have been tougher times,
Right.
and people have survived them. I think about my grandparents. My grandparents, you know, yes, I grew up in segregated Birmingham, but I was 8 when the Civil Rights Act passed. And I remember going to dinner for the first time at a restaurant. And the so-called Public Accommodations Act meant that for the first time, blacks could go to a restaurant. So my dad, about 2 days after it passed, my dad said, okay, let's go out to dinner. Okay, so we walked in, and these people all kind of looked up at us. And then they sort of realized, okay, and they went back. But my grandparents lived in that world for 60, 70 years.
Their entire lives.
And their entire lives. And so I always try to keep perspective on the fact that it has been worse, it could be, and that there are always those who have less. And so you should count yourself lucky to have so much.
Right. Did you or your parents ever have an encounter with the Ku Klux Klan?
Well, so Birmingham in 1963 was a very violent place. Mm-hmm. It had been, my little community had been pretty much shielded. You know, we had our own lessons and it was all shielded. And then in 1963, bombs were going off in neighborhoods all the time. One of our friends, Arthur Shores, a great civil rights lawyer, his house was bombed 3 times. And then on September 15th, 1963, we were at my father's church, and we felt a shudder. And in those days, you knew that a bomb had gone off someplace. And word began to spread that it had gone off at 16th Street Baptist Church, which was about 2 miles as the crow flies from my father's church.
And you felt it 2 miles away?
You could feel it. And then there were, of course, no cell phones, but people started a kind of phone tree. And, of course, the 4 little girls had been killed in that basement waiting for Sunday school by the Klan. Now, Denise McNair, who was one of the little girls killed, had been in my father's kindergarten. She was a friend of mine. I have pictures of me playing dolls with her. Cynthia Wesley lived down the street. Addie Mae Collins was in my uncle's homeroom class, and he said that Monday when he walked in that class, he just broke down and cried because her seat was empty. So it came home to us. Mm-hmm. This wasn't something that was theoretical. This wasn't something in the history books. It was in our neighborhoods. We knew it, and we lost people that we loved as a result of what was going on in that time.
How lovely that 60 years later you call them by name.
Yes.
You speak of them so lovingly.
Absolutely.
And you remember them.
Absolutely, and we have to remember them. And we have to remember the good times. We also have to remember what it took to get to where we are today.
Right. Will you explain National Security Advisor, which was your first great big role, the
Yes.
first female, to everyone, and what are the responsibilities?
Right. Well, Colin was also National Security Advisor.
And you
yes.
succeeded him, right?
He was a bit before me. I succeeded him as Secretary, right?
Okay.
Secretary of State, right? But National Security Advisor, so the way to think about it is it's the president's staff person. It's rarefied staff, to be sure, but the president's staff person for all national security. So you have basically 3 functions. The first is that you coordinate the rest of the government on behalf of the president. So if you have to decide what to do about Afghanistan, it's your job to get the Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, all together to see if you can get on the same page and make recommendations to the president. If you can't get them together, then it's your responsibility to make sure the president knows the varying views so that he can decide between the varying views. So you're helping the president's his cabinet officers to present their views, and you're helping the president to take account of those views. So you coordinate the government is one way to think about it. The second thing that you do is that you just make sure that the president has everything that he needs for every meeting that he's having, every phone call that he's having. And so before he's going to have a phone call with the president of Germany, or the chancellor of Germany, you want to make sure that he has the points that he needs to make, and you talk it through with him. And then other things that he might ask you to do. So I coordinated and helped him produce the president's emergency plan for AIDS relief. So when the president has a very high priority issue, he'll sometimes give it to the Secretary of State to make sure that it gets done. Then you travel with the president and usually get there an hour before the president so that you know what's going on in the world, so that when you brief him, and George W. Bush was an early person. So he was in the office at 7. So I had to be in the office at 6. And I exercised in the morning, which means I had to get up at 4:30. So those were some long, long, long days when I was National Security Advisor. When you're Secretary of State, other people do that for you, so you get to keep your own schedule.
You've also said that you were a procrastinator. You can't possibly be.
Oh, I was a terrible procrastinator. So one thing that I often say to my students, and I would say to all of you, is it's really important to once in a while sit down and have a talk with yourself about what is holding me back, and be real honest with yourself. Now, everybody says today, I want to be my authentic self. Yes, but sometimes your authentic self can use some help, right? And my authentic self was a procrastinator. If I could put it off till tomorrow, I would. Now, this doesn't work in learning languages, and it doesn't work in practicing the piano, because 8 hours in one day will not get you the same result as 1 hour for 8 days. So it didn't work in those, but boy, I was so good at reading the book the night before and passing and getting an A on the test. I was really good at it. But how stressful was that? And then I wasn't retaining anything. I remember going to Japan for the first time, and I'd taken a course called The World's Great Religions in college. And I got to Japan, and they were talking about these temples and all of those things, and I thought, I think I learned something about that in The World's Great Religions, but I don't remember any of it because I probably read the book before the night and taken the test. So I said, all right, so you're a procrastinator, what are you going to do about it? You're going to become a scheduler. So I schedule everything. When I get up in the morning, I know what I'm going to do with every increment all day long. It means that I use 15 minutes better than anybody that I know, because I know I can achieve that in 15 minutes. If I have to practice something on the piano, I'll say, I'll practice that little piece for 15 minutes.
So you still practice the piano?
I still practice the piano, still play. But that's how I've gotten over my procrastination. Now, it makes me sometimes not that much fun to go on vacation with, because I also schedule when I'm on vacation. Drives people crazy. But it was a way to get over my procrastination.
You became the National Security Advisor right before September 11th attack.
That's right, 8 months before. 8 months before.
How did your job change when that happened?
Well, once it happened, it was all about protecting the country. Yeah. Now, I had expected to do the things that I studied, you know, great power politics, the Russians, the Chinese, some international economics. We all knew that terrorism was a threat, but that it would actually take place in the United States. Yeah. Because we had not had an attack on the territory of the United States since the War of 1812. So we had no way, really, of dealing with this. And I will still never forget the shock of that day, because President Bush was at a children's event in Florida. And I came in maybe a little bit later that day, because I knew he was not going to be there. And I was getting ready, reading things, and my assistant, who was a young military officer, came in and said that a plane had hit the World Trade Center. And I remember thinking what a terrible accident that was. And calling President Bush, he said, that's a terrible accident. Then a few minutes later, we learned a second plane had hit the World Trade Center. Now we knew it was a terrorist attack. And I was trying to reach the national security principals. Colin was actually in Peru for a meeting of the Organization of American States.
He was Secretary of State.
He was Secretary of State at the time. They said George Tenet, the CIA director, had already gone to a bunker at CIA. And then we were trying to reach Secretary Rumsfeld, but his phone just kept ringing and ringing and ringing. And we looked behind us on TV, and a plane had hit the Pentagon. And at that point, they said, you've got to get to a bunker. The planes are flying into buildings all over D.C. The White House is probably next. And when the Secret Service wants to escort you, they don't really so much escort you, they kind of pick you up.
Literally pick you up?
Literally pick you up. And I remember kind of being levitated toward the bunker and saying, no, I have to make a call. I had to call the president and tell him, don't come back here. It's not safe. And from that moment on, it's all about preventing it happening again. That's your every day. You get up thinking, we can't let it happen again.
So your job almost becomes get them before they get us.
Get them before they get us. And after, there were so many threats that were just terrifying. You know, a smallpox threat, anthrax threat, a radiological threat against Washington, D.C. Wow. And it changes your view of national security pretty quickly.
Well, politics have evolved. And last night, Donald Trump announced again that he's running for president.
Yeah.
How do you feel about that?
Well, time for a new generation. You know, let's move on. I just, you know, there are 330 million Americans, probably 260 million who are actually eligible to be president. Let's say it's 200 million. You know, take out children, people under the age of. We can do better.
We can find somebody else.
We can find somebody else. We can find somebody else.
A good answer. Yeah. You also, another thing that I read is you said nobody wants to go to war. Nobody in his right mind wants to go to war.
Absolutely.
Which makes me think of Vladimir Putin.
Yeah. Well, he was in his right mind, but you know, I spent a lot of time with him.
Do you really think he is in his right mind?
He's different, Susan. He's different than the Vladimir Putin I knew. Okay. So I spent 8 years talking to Vladimir Putin a lot. And at one point, he kind of liked me because I'm a Russianist, and we would chit-chat in Russian, and he thought I understood Russia. But something in the last, you know, it turns out he's a germaphobe, and he was completely isolated during COVID. I think he talked to a lot of Russian mystics who told him it was his station in life to reestablish the Russian Empire. Because he told me once, he said, Condi, you know us. Russia has only been great when it's been ruled by great men, like Peter the Great and Alexander II. Now, he didn't say
he thought he was
those people, you know, the expanse of the Russian Empire. He didn't say, by the way, Lenin, and he didn't say Catherine the Great. Of course, she was a woman, so I guess she didn't count. But anyway, he wanted to reestablish the Russian Empire. And if you're going to do that, you can't have an independent Ukraine. And he tried to extinguish an independent Ukraine. Do you know that his army went to war with 5 days' provisions and their dress uniforms for the parade in Kyiv? That's how badly he miscalculated.
Yeah, and we're not prepared at all.
No, not at all prepared. Wow. Not at all prepared. And now they are, I don't know if you've seen these stories of these poor Russian men who are being mobilized, no training. One soldier said he'd shot a gun like twice before he was sent to the front. They're just cannon fodder.
How do you think it's going to end, and do you think we need to be concerned about the nuclear option?
I think it's not going to end for a while because the Ukrainians are making progress and the Russians are not going to give back territory that they've declared Russian, so I think it's going to be a while. I don't mean to make light of the nuclear threat because fortunately I'm not in a position of government, so I don't have to worry in the same way, but I don't think he'll do it. I think that he actually, in a funny sort of way, he wants to be admired and respected as a world leader. So if you'll notice, he keeps inviting anybody who will go to Moscow. He doesn't want to be the North Korean leader who's isolated and nobody talks to. And if he were ever to use nuclear weapons, that would be the end of that. Right. Secondly, I'm not so sure that those nuclear weapons that have been in the field for 40 years would actually do anything.
Well, that's good to know.
I wonder if the generals would actually carry out that order. Do they want to die with him? Yeah. And then I hope somebody has told him that actually winds blow east. So that wouldn't be so good for Russia itself. Yeah.
hopefully they have told him that.
I hope somebody's
Yeah.
told him.
Sports have played a big part in your life.
They sure have.
Your dad, you inherited, we're going to call it, his love of football,
Yes.
and now you're
Of anything with a score at the end, actually. I just love sports. I love sports. Yeah.
And you've said that you watch hours of football every week, yeah? And you also love golf.
Football came early. My dad was a football coach. Yeah, he was Presbyterian minister, high school guidance counselor. He had all kinds of jobs. Well, one of them was football coach. And I was supposed to be his All-American linebacker, and I'm an only child. And so he decided to teach me all about sports instead. And I mean, really teach me. So I can remember sitting there watching the football game, and it was like, Condoleezza, what are they doing? Daddy, that's a trap block. What are they doing? They're setting up a screen, Daddy. So I really knew the X's and O's of football, and I loved it. And I still love it. But like I said, almost anything with a score at the end. But then golf I took up at the age of 50.
So did I.
Yeah.
It's good.
It's good.
Fun.
I'm not terrible.
So our next door neighbor and a really good friend is Retief Goosen.
Oh,
and
yes.
I don't know how he found out, but he texted me yesterday and he goes, I hear you're interviewing Condoleezza. He said, I've met her several
He
times
has, yes, I have.
when he was inducted
In the Hall of Fame, yes, right.
And
I've been in pro-ams that he's been in, yes.
And then he texted, she should be president.
Well, thanks, but no thanks.
So you had the South African vote.
The South African vote, right, exactly.
But did you ever seriously consider running for president? No. You didn't?
You have to have the right DNA to run for office.
I don't think so.
Those people,
Look, you really think that?
those people are different.
Yeah.
People who want to do that are different. I found it exhausting to be in a campaign. They find it energizing to be in a campaign. I love policy. I really don't like politics. And so, no, I think I was in the right jobs, and now I'm in the right job back at Stanford.
Okay.
Right?
But would you ever consider being vice president?
No. Okay. That's an even
Did
worse
they
job.
ask you? Did they?
People have said to me, you're on so-and-so list, and I say, well, tell them to take me off the list,
Oh.
right? Because president is a really tough job. Vice president is a tough job without being president, which never seemed like a good trade to me. Yeah.
Especially in the last administration.
Yeah.
We're going to open it up to questions from our audience. It's difficult to see you guys, but if you will raise your hand and maybe move it around. We have a question right here. Yeah.
Hi.
Oh,
Yeah.
that's so cool.
Hi,
Yes,
Hadika.
I think so.
So you talked a lot about Russia and its invasion of Ukraine. And I actually recall an interview you did a while back with Fox News talking about how it's, and what was it? A violation of international law and international order.
Right.
And I mean, I really appreciated that. And also, I think we can both agree it's just so against like fundamental human rights. So I think my question is just, does that same standard that we hold President Putin to also apply to U.S. presidents like George Bush, who is an administration you obviously served under?
Yes.
And, you know, the war crimes that we've committed in the Middle East and all of the human rights violations that have gone on there, specifically in 2003, of course, with Iraq and the millions of civilians that have been murdered by the U.S. Are we going to start to take accountability for this and
Yes.
responsibility?
Well, all right, thank you for your question. And the first thing I'll say is that, of course, the Iraqis under Saddam Hussein, there were 17 Security Council resolutions in the UN that said that he was in violation of international law. No such thing exists with Vladimir Putin and Ukraine. Secondly, we had fought a war against Saddam Hussein. As a matter of fact, when Colin was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, because he had invaded Kuwait and because he was developing weapons of mass destruction. And so we'd actually fought a war against him. We were in an armistice in 1991, and he was violating the armistice on a daily basis. So there was international law surrounding the US decision, along with, by the way, a number of other countries, Great Britain, Poland, Australia, et cetera, to actually decide to make him pay. We didn't kill millions of civilians in Iraq. That's simply not true. Saddam Hussein, on the other hand, did put 1 million civilian Iranians in mass graves, and Kurds and Shia in mass graves. So no, I don't think it is comparable, because international law talks about the need, and it sounds like maybe you take international politics, the need for anticipatory self-defense, it's called. And when you have a Saddam Hussein who has had weapons of mass destruction, who we thought had weapons of mass destruction again, who has violated Security Council resolution after Security Council resolution after Security Council resolution, who's shooting at our planes every day as we're trying to keep his planes on the ground so that he can't kill Kurds, no, I think the situation's different.
Thank you. Thank you. We have another question?
Thank you. I'm Venezuelan, and I know it's very public. I've read a couple articles where you had not the pleasure, but the opportunity to meet Chavez.
Yes.
Now, Venezuela is the biggest humanitarian crisis in the world, with the biggest amount of migrants.
Yes.
Many of those are crossing the border here in the U.S.
Yes.
Governor DeSantis in Florida sent them on a plane to Martha's Vineyard, which turned Venezuelans into political chips right now. What are your thoughts on that? And if you were Secretary of State right now, how would you handle that situation?
Yes, well, first of all, Chavez, of course, helped to destroy his country. And then he gave way to Maduro, who is Chavez without charm. And Maduro has further destroyed the country to the point that Colombia and surrounding countries are dealing with refugee crisis and refugee movement. The United States has a long record of asylum seeking. And I would think Venezuelans ought to be, at this point, eligible for asylum by the standard of what's going on in the country. So there are two ways to think about asylum. One is individual asylum, all right? So you're a political prisoner or somebody who's persecuted by the government. The other is that there are groups of people who are persecuted, and I think Venezuelans would, to my mind, probably fit into that category at this point. It's very difficult because when the United States accepts asylum seekers, we don't have camps for them. What we try to do is to integrate people into the communities. And so it limits the number of people that we can take. But I think we're trying to help, as I understand it, we're trying to help the Colombians with the refugee problem that they have. But ultimately, the issue is going to be to do something about the situation in Venezuela. And we tried. I think we were that close to getting Maduro to leave the country. The Russians actually intervened, and the Cubans actually intervened. And he's still there, and all you can do is continue to put pressure on him. There are a number of Venezuelan leaders in exile who I know we remain in touch with. In fact, there are some Venezuelan embassy personnel who've spread out across the world to go to different embassies, and I've met with some of them. So I think you just have to keep trying to bring pressure on Maduro, and hopefully, this used to be a wealthy country, Venezuela. And now it's very sad what has happened.
Beautiful, wealthy country. Really
Yeah,
pretty
beautiful,
country,
wealthy country.
Lots of resources.
Yep.
Any other questions? Up here? Here, let's get you a microphone.
Yeah,
Hold
get a
on one
microphone.
second.
Hi, my name is Yaroslav Pekarchuk, and I just want to know, what kind of policies are you into, and what are, the benefits that you think that can help with society?
What kind of policies do I'm sorry, I didn't quite
What kind of policies that you talk about, and which one you think is beneficial to society?
Yeah, I think the thing that's most beneficial to society is for people to have a chance. And so I've been involved for many, many years, both as a university professor, but also in advocating for K-12 education and reform in K-12 education, and for work with boys and girls clubs for underserved kids. Because I think that everybody deserves a chance. Everybody deserves a chance to escape whatever circumstances they were born into. You asked about Venezuelans. People come here from around the world just to be a part of the opportunity here. And so I think the policies that are most beneficial to society are ones that have to do with education, because that way people will be able to recognize their dreams, to take care of themselves, to take care of their families. And these days, without high quality education, you have no chance.
So from talking about 3 different countries and 3 different problems.
Yes.
And Boys and Girls Club is so impactful, and seeing that, and Condoleezza was in a meeting with my husband discussing the need to build Boys and Girls Club like clubs outside the United States. And you were very vocal like him, but the charter for the United States doesn't allow clubs to be built outside the United States. So my husband and I started the World Federation of Youth Clubs, which is doing just that in other countries around there. We're in over 30 countries now, 39 countries with a few thousand clubs, several thousand clubs. And hopefully you'll get involved with that too.
Yes, absolutely.
Because
That's
it sounds like not only here in the United States, but you know the impact that that can
Yes,
have around the
right.
world,
Around the
where there's
world.
greater need even than here. So one more question. I think we need to wrap it up. Oh my gosh, lots of
Well-
hands. You pick one.
Thank you so much for coming, first of all. It really means a lot, and your story is really inspiring.
Thank you.
Russia's aggression against the free world in the 21st century has been undoubtable. Under the Bush administration, they invaded Georgia. Under the Obama administration, they invaded Crimea. In 2016, they interfered with our elections, and now it's their invasion in Ukraine. One of your predecessors, Henry Kissinger, suggested that we should find an appeasement with Russia, which includes giving away land of eastern Ukraine that includes Crimea, Kherson, and Donbass as a whole. Do you agree with Secretary Kissinger that we ought to appease Russia?
Right. I was just with Secretary Kissinger. He's 99 years old. He made the trip to Tokyo. So that's pretty remarkable. But I think he...
Inspiring.
Right, it's inspiring. And his point, because I asked him about this quote, and his point was, you should always be open to negotiation, and here are some of the possible ways that we might get there. But I don't think he would disagree with me that given what the Russian or the Ukrainian people have gone through, you can't tell them to start giving back land, especially when they seem to be making significant progress against the Ukrainians, or against the Russians. And Kherson is the very good example of this, you know. Now, you rightly talk about a few times before this February invasion, and I've asked myself, could we have done more after Georgia, after Crimea, which might have prevented Vladimir Putin from thinking he would get away with what he did to go after Kyiv. In 2008, with Georgia, they actually didn't get very far. They got about 15 miles into Georgia. And we wanted very much to do more in the way of sanctions at that point. Shortly after that, there was a big financial crisis, you might remember. And so it was a little hard to get people to rally around sanctions and the like. But maybe we did miss an opportunity to send a stronger message to Putin. And maybe we missed an opportunity in 2014 when the Obama administration was in power to send. But it's always hard because exactly what are you going to do to the Russians? This time, they so violated international law and norms that I think people were more willing to act than they had been in the past. But I think Henry would say he was really just putting out there that you should always be able to negotiate, not actually a plan for negotiation.
You've had to make some incredibly difficult decisions that at the time, based on the information that you have,
Right.
and then years, decades later, maybe you realize because you have better information,
Yeah.
you know, that it was the wrong decision. But at that time, that was the right thing to do.
Yeah, or that it was the decision that given what you knew at the time. I always remind people that what you know today can affect what you do tomorrow, but what you know today cannot affect what you did yesterday. And all of us have been through those circumstances. The one that I actually probably regret most is that we didn't see 9/11 coming. I think we did everything that we knew how to do. I think the intelligence way we were set up, where we did intelligence outside the country, intelligence inside the country, but we didn't link them up, probably blinded us to what was possible. Certainly nobody imagined that there might be airplanes used as missiles. But to this day, I have great remorse about the fact that 3,000 people, many of them right here in this city, died because we didn't see it coming.
Do you think there was the information there, that it had it been analyzed differently?
You can always go back and piece it together once you know the picture. It's once you know where the picture ended up, you can go back and say, oh yeah, that's where that fit, and that's where that fit, and that's where that fit. But if we had known anything of this, we would have tried to stop it. It's just that we didn't have the information in the way that would have led us to believe what was about to happen. Yeah.
Well, thank goodness another one has not happened. So
thank goodness for that.
You guys,
Yes.
whatever the policies, et cetera, that you put into place after that and helped.
Yes,
Yeah.
I think so. Yes.
So anyway, thank you so much.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure being with
Great.
all of you.
Thank you, guys. Thank you. It was really, really